In this section, I will tell you about the ancient Egyptian god Osiris. In this episode, I prepared a very detailed documentary for you. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment and turn on notifications to support the growth of my channel. Osiris was the first son of Geb and Nut and the brother of Set, Horus, Isis, and Nephthys. He was one of the most prominent gods of the Heliopolitan, but his worship predated the development of this fairly complex philosophy. Although Atum was installed as the head of the Ened by the priests of Heliopolis, Osiris was considered to be the king of the underworld, and is the only deity who is referred to simply as God. This gives us some indication of his prominence and popularity. The oldest religious texts known to us refer to him as the great god of the dead, who once possessed human form and lived upon earth. After his murder by Set, Osiris became the king of the underworld and presided over the judgment of dead souls. In order to enter his kingdom, the deceased had to undertake a perilous journey to the Hall of Judgment where their heart was balanced against the feather of Mat. It is important to distinguish this from the Christian view of judgment. The ancient Egyptians were a pragmatic people. A person was not expected to be perfect, just balanced. An example of this is the negative confession, which indicates that it was more a case of convincing Osiris that you deserved admission rather than passively awaiting judgment. As Osiris had been a good and beneficent ruler during his lifetime, his presence in the underworld no doubt gave the people great comfort. Furthermore, the only barriers to entrance were those relating to the journey to the Hall of Judgment and the preservation of the body and your name. The spells needed to pass through Duat were described in great detail in the Pyramid and Coffin texts, the Book of Coming Forth by Day and the Book of Gates. A decent burial combined with these spells pretty much guaranteed you would be welcomed into a blissful existence which bore a striking similarity to the ancient Egyptians' everyday life. Osiris was also a god of agriculture. This may seem rather strange as he was dead, and technically infertile. However, it actually makes a lot of sense when you consider the death and rebirth inherent in the agricultural cycle of planting and harvesting grain. Every harvest, the god was symbolically killed and his body broken on the threshing room floor. But after the inundation, life would return to the land and the crops would grow again. Legend held that the ancient Egyptians had been cannibals until Osiris developed agriculture and he and Isis persuaded them to cease that unpleasant habit. There is no evidence that the ancient peoples were in fact cannibals, but the myth underlined the notion that Osiris brought order from chaos and established the culture which formed the basis of their successful and durable civilization. Osiris was usually depicted as a mummified king, complete with the ceremonial beard, crown, flail, and crozier. His skin is generally green or black, to represent the fact that he is dead. He usually wears the white crown of Upper Egypt or the Atef crown. The feathers on the Atef crown are thought to represent Jeddu, the cult center of Osiris. His kind smile confirms that he is not a deity to be feared. In fact, Osiris represented the Egyptian belief in rebirth and their feeling that order and justice persevered beyond the grave. corn mummies made of seeded dirt were molded to represent Osiris and interred with the deceased. They would germinate in the darkness of the tomb and illustrate the concept of life from death. Some fine examples made of barley and emmer were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. During the 4th month of the season of Akhet, a number of festivals were celebrated at all the chief sanctuaries of Osiris in Egypt, to commemorate the events of Osiris' life, death, and rebirth. Spectators took part in the Passion plays and everyone seems to have had a great time. The many festivals are recorded on a stele established by Khnofret. The myth of Osiris and Isis. Set had been jealous of his brother Osiris' power and popularity for some time, and he lusted after his brother's wife, Isis. When Osiris decided to travel the world to bring civilization to its people, he made Isis regent of Egypt instead of Set. This was the last straw. Set was strong and brave, but he had a terrible temper and he vowed to kill his brother and take the power he considered to be rightfully his. Set invited Osiris to a banquet and had a beautiful cedar wood and ebony chest made just for the occasion. He offered the chest to anyone who could fit into it. Just as Set planned, none of the other guests fitted the chest perfectly. The only person left to try was Osiris. When he lay down in the chest, Set slammed on the lid and nailed it down. He sealed it with molten lead and threw it in the Nile. The chest was swept out to sea and landed on the coast near Byblos. The instant it touched the land, a huge tamarisk tree sprouted up to protect it. The tree grew so large that the king of Byblos trimmed it and set it up as a pillar in his palace. Isis tracked the body of Osiris to Byblos and persuaded the king to give it to her. She took her husband's corpse back to Egypt and used magic to conceive his child, Horus. However, Set found Osiris's body unattended while Isis took the infant Horus to be cared for by Wadjet. Set cut the corpse of Osiris into 14 parts and distributed them around Egypt. Isis was distraught and enlisted the help of her sister Nephthys. They found all but one of the pieces. The missing part was his penis, which was apparently swallowed by a fish sacred to Set. Isis and Nephthys mourned over the dead body of their brother and Ra took pity on them. He sent Anubis to prepare Osiris for the first ever mummification, and instructed Thoth, Isis, and Nephthys to piece the body back together. Isis transformed into a kite and breathed life into him. But it was not sufficient for him to take his place with the living. Instead he traveled to the underworld, a seemingly dark and desolate place. But Re reassured him that he would find peace and contentment as the king of the dead, and his son Horus would rule over the living until the time that Re chose to unmake his creation and return everything to the nothingness from whence it came. Osiris and Anubis. Later, when the theology of Heliopolis and Hermopolis were merged, Osiris took over the role of Anubis as the god of the underworld. It was believed that Anubis had given way to Osiris out of respect, and a myth developed that Anubis was in fact the son of Osiris by Nephthys. Nephthys was not happy with Set, and so she sneakily disguised herself as her sister Isis and slept with Osiris. Nephthys was considered to be barren, but despite this she conceived Anubis. Surprisingly, Isis does not seem to get annoyed at either party, but unsurprisingly Set was furious. Thus, the myth provided a more personal reason for his vendetta against Osiris. The myth is also thought to relate to one of the desert flowers common in ancient Egypt which did not bloom for years on end. However, a large inundation would bring it to life. Thus the barren desert became fertile, and Osiris' connection with the life-giving Nile is strengthened. Horus the Elder and Horus the Child. There are many separate hawk deities called Horus who are often confused. In the theology of Heliopolis, Horus the Child was the child of Isis and Osiris. However, in Hermopolis, Horus the Elder was the son or husband of Hathor. When the two theologies merged, Hathor and Isis became closely associated, and Horus the Elder became the brother of Osiris and Set. Thus Horus could be a solar deity or an Osirian and hence stellar deity. This confused the hell out of Plutarch, who made up the story that Horus the Elder was conceived by Isis and Osiris while they were in Nut's womb. The pyramid texts confirm their separate identities, as Horus the Elder warns the other gods not to get involved with Horus the Younger and his evil things. Set was also the enemy of Horus the Elder, and some Egyptologists suggest that the battle for control of Egypt was actually played out between those two deities, with Osiris being inserted at a later time. The many names and forms of Osiris. Osiris is the Greek form of his name. He was known to the Egyptians as a seer. The earliest form of his name used hieroglyphs for throne and eye, leading some to infer that his name means he sees the throne. It is also possible that the second hieroglyph refers to the great eye of heaven, Ra. The throne or seat is the first sign in the name of Aset, who is the female counterpart of Osiris. In the late period, Osiris was known as Un-Nefer, from Un and Neferu. He had too many epithets to mention, partly because he adopted many of those originally possessed by other local gods whose attributes he assumed over time. In Memphis, Ta-Sokar was the result of the combination of Ta and Sokar, a local falcon god who protected tombs and was the patron of the workers who built them. As a god of reincarnation, Ta-Sokar became identified with Osiris, becoming Ta-Sokar, a seer. This deity represented the sun during its journey through the underworld before it was reborn at dawn. Osiris also managed to absorb many other deities, making his worship a constant feature all over Egypt. He was most closely associated with Anjati, Su, Kenshamenshu, Sepa, Bainbcht, Wepwit, Serapis, and Anhur in his form as Zarahes Nefer and both the Apis and Bacchus bulls. Osiris is a Latin transliteration of the ancient Greek Hypa, which in turn is the Greek adaptation of the original name in the Egyptian language. In Egyptian hieroglyphs the name appears as WSJR, which some Egyptologists instead choose to transliterate as SJR or JSJRJ. since hieroglyphic writing lacks vowels. Egyptologists have vocalized the name in various ways, such as Asar, Ozza, Wezza, User, or Uzar. Several proposals have been made for the etymology and meaning of the original name, as Egyptologist Mark J. Smith notes. None are fully convincing. Most take WSJR as the accepted transliteration, following Adolf Ehrman, John Gwynne Griffiths, bearing in mind Ehrman's emphasis on the fact that the name must begin with an W, proposes a derivation from WSR with an original meaning of the Mighty One. Kurt Seth proposes a compound STJRT, meaning seat of the eye, in a hypothetical earlier form WSTJRT. This is rejected by Griffiths on phonetic grounds. David Lawton takes up this same compound but explains STJRT as signifying product, something made. Osiris representing the product of the ritual mummification process. Wolfhard Westendorf proposes an etymology from WSTJRT, she who bears the eye. Mark J. Smith makes no definitive proposals but asserts that the second element must be a form of JRJ. However, recently alternative transliterations have been proposed. Yoshi Machiki re-examines Ehrman's evidence that the throne hieroglyph in the word is to be read WS and finds it unconvincing, suggesting instead that the name should be read SJR on the basis of Aramaic, Phoenician, and Old South Arabian transcriptions, readings of the throne sign in other words, and comparison with St. James P. Allen reads the word as JSJRT but revises the reading to JSJRJ and derives it from JSJRJ, meaning engendering principle. The pyramid texts describe early conceptions of an afterlife in terms of eternal traveling with the sun god amongst the stars. Amongst these mortuary texts, at the beginning of the 4th dynasty, is found an offering the king gives and Anubis. By the end of the 5th dynasty, the formula in all tombs becomes an offering the king gives and Osiris. Osiris is the mythological father of the god Horus, whose conception is described in the Osiris myth. The myth describes Osiris as having been killed by his brother Set, who wanted Osiris' throne. His wife, Isis, finds the body of Osiris and hides it in the reeds where it is found and dismembered by Set. Isis retrieves and joins the fragmented pieces of Osiris, then briefly revives him by use of magic. This spell gives her time to become pregnant by Osiris. Isis later gives birth to Horus. Since Horus was born after Osiris' resurrection, Horus became thought of as a representation of new beginnings and the vanquisher of the usurper Set. Tarsekha thus gradually became identified with Osiris, the two becoming Tarsekha Osiris. As the sun was thought to spend the night in the underworld, and was subsequently reborn every morning, Tarsekha Osiris was identified as king of the underworld, god of the afterlife, life, death, and regeneration. Osiris' soul, or rather his Ba, was occasionally worshipped in its own right, almost as if it were a distinct god, especially in the delta city of Mendes. This aspect of Osiris was referred to as dismembered, which is grammatically feminine, literally the bar of the Lord of the Jed, which roughly means the soul of the Lord of the pillar of continuity. The Jed, a type of pillar, was usually understood as the backbone of Osiris. The Nile supplying water, and Osiris who died only to be resurrected, represented continuity and stability. As dismembered, Osiris was given epithets such as Lord of the Sky and Life of the Ra. Ba does not mean soul in the Western sense, and has to do with power, reputation, force of character, especially in the case of a god. Since the Ba was associated with power, and also happened to be a word for ram in Egyptian, dismembered was depicted as a ram, or as ram-headed. A living, sacred ram was kept at Mendes and worshipped as the incarnation of the god, and upon death, the rams were mummified and buried in a ram-specific necropolis. Dismembered was consequently said to be Horus' father, as dismembered was an aspect of Osiris. Regarding the association of Osiris with the ram, the god's traditional crook and flail are the instruments of the shepherd, which has suggested to some scholars also an origin for Osiris in herding tribes of the Upper Nile. Annual ceremonies were performed in honor of Osiris in various places across Egypt, evidences of which were discovered during underwater archaeological excavations of Frank Gaudio and his team in the sunken city of Thanes Heracleion. These ceremonies were fertility rites which symbolize the resurrection of Osiris. Recent scholars emphasize the androgynous character of fertility clear from surviving material. For instance, Osiris' fertility has to come both from being castrated, cut into pieces, and the reassembly by female Isis, whose embrace of her reassembled Osiris produces the perfect king, Horus. Further, as attested by tomb inscriptions, both women and men could syncretize with Osiris at their death, another set of evidence that underlines Osiris' androgynous nature. Plutarch and others have noted that the sacrifices to Osiris were gloomy, solemn, and mournful. And that the Great Mystery Festival, celebrated in 2 phases, began at Abydos commemorating the death of the god, on the same day that grain was planted in the ground. The annual festival involved the construction of Osiris beds formed in shape of Osiris, filled with soil and sown with seed. The germinating seeds symbolized Osiris rising from the dead. An almost pristine example was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The image image of a stuffed, headless skin of an animal tied to a pole mounting a pot, was a symbol associated both with Osiris as god of the underworld and with Anubis, god of mummification, was sometimes included among a deceased person's funerary equipment. The first phase of the festival was a public drama depicting the murder and dismemberment of Osiris, the search for his body by Isis, his triumphal return as the resurrected god, and the battle in which Horus defeated Set. According to Julius Firmicus Maternus of the 4th century, this play was reenacted each year by worshippers who beat their breasts and gashed their shoulders. when they pretend that the mutilated remains of the god have been found and rejoined. They turn from mourning to rejoicing. The passion of Osiris was reflected in his name when an Nefer, which also alludes to his post-mortem power. Much of the extant information about the rites of Osiris can be found on the Akenofrit stela at Abydos erected in the 12th dynasty by Akenofrit, possibly a priest of Osiris or other official during the reign of Senusret III. The ritual reenactment of Osiris's funeral rites were held in the last month of the inundation, coinciding with spring, and held at Abydos, which was the traditional place where the body of Osiris drifted ashore after having been drowned in the Nile. The part of the myth recounting the chopping up of the body into 14 pieces by Set is not recounted in this particular stela, although it is attested to be a part of the rituals by a version of the papyrus Jumalhak, in which it took Isis 12 days to reassemble the pieces, coinciding with the festival of plowing. Some elements of the ceremony were held in the temple, while others involved public participation in a form of theatre. The stela of Akenofrit recounts the program of events of the public elements over the 5 days of the festival. The first day, the procession of Wepwit, a mock battle, was enacted during which the enemies of Osiris are defeated. A procession was led by the god Wepwit. The second day, the great procession of Osiris, the body of Osiris was taken from his temple to his tomb. The boat he was transported in, the Nishmet bark, had to be defended against his enemies. The third day, Osiris is mourned and the enemies of the land are destroyed. The fourth day, night vigil, prayers and recitations are made and funeral rites performed. The fifth day, Osiris is reborn. Osiris is reborn at dawn and crowned with the crown of Mat. The statue of Osiris is brought back to the temple. Contrasting with the public theatrical ceremonies sourced from the Middle Kingdom Akenofrit stele, more esoteric ceremonies were performed inside the temples by priests. Plutarch mentions that 2 days after the beginning of the festival the priests bring forth a sacred chest containing a small golden coffer, into which they pour some potable water. And a great shout arises from the company for joy that Osiris is found. Then they knead some fertile soil with the water. And fashion therefrom a crescent-shaped figure, which they cloth and adorn, this indicating that they regard these gods as the substance of earth and water. Yet his accounts were still obscure, for he also wrote, "I pass over the cutting of the wood, opting not to describe it, since he considered it as a most sacred ritual." In the Osirian temple at Dendera, an inscription describes in detail the making of wheat paste models of each dismembered piece of Osiris to be sent out to the town where each piece is discovered by Isis. At the temple of Mendes, figures of Osiris were made from wheat and paste placed in a trough on the day of the murder. Then water was added for several days, until finally the mixture was kneaded into a mold of Osiris and taken to the temple to be buried. Molds were made from the wood of a red tree in the forms of the 16 dismembered parts of Osiris. The cakes of divine bread were made from each mold, placed in a silver chest and set near the head of the god with the inward parts of Osiris as described in the Book of the Dead. The early Ptolemaic kings promoted a new god, Serapis, who combined traits of Osiris with those of various Greek gods and was portrayed in a Hellenistic form. Serapis was often treated as the consort of Isis and became the patron deity of the Ptolemies' capital, Alexandria. Serapis's origins are not known. Some ancient authors claim the cult of Serapis was established at Alexandria by Alexander the Great himself. But most who discuss the subject of Serapis's origins give a story similar to that by Plutarch, writing about 400 years after the fact. Plutarch claimed that Ptolemy I established the cult after dreaming of a colossal statue at Sinope in Anatolia. His counselors identified the statue as the Greek god Pluto and said that the Egyptian name for Pluto was Serapis. This name may have been a Hellenization of Osiris Apis. Osiris Apis was a patron deity of the Memphite necropolis and the father of the Apis bull who was worshipped there. And texts from Ptolemaic times treat Serapis as the Greek translation of Osiris Apis. But little of the early evidence for Serapis's cult comes from Memphis, and much of it comes from the Mediterranean world with no reference to an Egyptian origin for Serapis. So Mark Smith expresses doubt that Serapis originated as a Greek form of Osiris Apis's name and leaves open the possibility that Serapis originated outside Egypt.